Welcome to July 18, 1863, Morris Island, South Carolina. Charleston Harbor at low tide evening recorded as about sunset. Fort Wagner identified as the earthwork on the north end of the island. The 54th Massachusetts Volunteer Infantry forms part of the storming column. Company designations appear on the day's rolls without adornment. This is the record as it was written then. An official line states the assault commenced at dusk. Another entry notes fire from the fort was severe and continuous. Returns for the day are set out as killed, wounded, missing. Weather remarks read wind from the south, surf moderate. Ammunition expenditure is tallied by battery and caliber. No explanation is attached to these entries. Missing after the assault on Fort Wagner, South Carolina, July 18, 1863. Missing not accounted for at roll call following engagement. Wounded sent to transport for removal. Killed in action, interment on the field reported. Color sergeant severely wounded. Flag preserved. The remarks are entered as received. The old flag never touched the ground. The phrase is preserved in accounts of the color bearer. The flag is described as torn. The staff splintered. The bearer is marked severely wounded and carried to the rear. No additional sentiment appears beside the notation. The page moves on to the next line. A brief dispatch reads, "Attack unsuccessful. Loss heavy." Another line records assault repulsed, outer works temporarily carried. Timestamps appear as 9 p.m. and after dark in different hands. The returns are compiled during the night. Names are added as stretcher parties report. Blank spaces follow where no report arrives. Rolls from earlier months list present for duty absent on detached service. July entries continue, then break with casualty in action. Pay due is written beside names without resolution. Abbreviations recur, due, trans FD righted to duty. The column last paid is filled, stoppages remains blank. Midway through the handwriting changes ink and slope. In the city church registers add entries for burial and memorial service. The dates align with the aftermath of the assault. Some names carry a cross mark in the margin. A note indicates no body recovered. The hand remains careful even when the line is short. The page number is circled once. Later, the Bureau records list dependents applying for pensions. Affidavits state relationship, service, and loss. Testimony is taken before a local agent signed with marks. Dates of service include to July 18, 1863. The form requests proof of identity and proof of marriage. Attachments are referenced and not found. A newspaper column prints assault on Morris Island, gallant conduct of colored troops. Another column lists names under killed, wounded, and missing. The account mentions a storm of grape and canister. A correction the next day amends a figure and a letter in a name. A brief notice acknowledges letters too late for this edition. The press date falls on the Sunday following. The regimental commander is reported fallen on the parapet. The line places him at the head of his men. The words are plain on the page. The next sentence records succession of command. Casualty numbers appear followed by a total. A signature closes the report. A note states the dead were interred on the beach near the work. The location is described without coordinates. The statement adds they were buried with their comrades. No further particulars are given. The record does not return to the scene. The ledger proceeds to other business. Tide tables for the harbor show evening low water. Ordnance returns list spent ammunition by caliber and count. Medical returns list gunshot wound, contusion, amputation advised. Transport names are written for removal of wounded. Surgeons are named. Laborers carrying stretchers are not. The space for remarks remains blank. Unit returns compiled weeks later retain names under missing. The column does not resolve to a later status. The handwriting is the same. The ink is weaker. A notation adds supposed killed. Another adds no further information. The page is docketed and filed. An award citation issued years later references July 18, 1863. The citation repeats the phrase concerning the flag. The date of issue is entered with care. The interval between the act and the paper is measured in years. The final line bears a name and office. Earlier pages remain unchanged. The record does not say what was felt on the sand. It does not record the sound between volleys. It does not measure the dark beyond the parapet. It lists names times outcomes. It leaves blanks where answers did not arrive. It preserves the silence that followed. Before we begin, leave the comment where you are watching from. Write the exact minute and second you paused. Record what line you were on. Note what detail you noticed first. State what you did not find on the page. What did you feel in that silence? July 18, 1863 is the fixed date. Morris Island, South Carolina is the fixed place. The work named Fort Wagner is the objective described in official texts produced by the Department of the South. The unit, identified as the 54th Massachusetts Volunteer Infantry, appears in Regimental Returns Company rolls and subsequent state reports. The opening question is limited and practical. Which entries constitute contemporaneous observation, which constitute later compilation? And where do the unresolved notations originate that persist as missing across multiple ledgers? The principal contemporary layer consists of field and departmental reports transmitted within hours and days of the assault and later printed in the War of the Rebellion compilation. These documents identify time by dusk after dark and specific clock notations that do not always align. They are signed by commanders and adjutants, and they enumerate casualties by killed, wounded, and missing. They are preserved in federal printed volumes and in departmental copies on file with the departmental series cross-indexed to incoming reports and endorsements. At the regimental level, the material is contained in morning reports, casualty lists, company descriptive books, and monthly returns. These show the names of enlisted men and officers with status lines that may shift across editions, particularly where a man is first entered as missing and later annotated as supposed killed with no body recovered. The clerical hand can change within a single page, and ink changes can mark the moment when stretcher parties' burial details or picket inquiries added partial information. These items survive today in state archives and federal service record packets. Letters from officers and enlisted men exist in manuscript and print. Some were written before the assault and mention expectations, others were posted from hospital transports after the event and list names among the wounded. A Boston officer who later published a regimental history reused his correspondence and notes to compile the roster and narrative with citations to official papers. Letters by black correspondents covering the regiment appeared in the New York Black Press and were date-lined from the Department of the South. These printed pieces are accessible in microfilm and digital newspaper collections. Medical evidence is present in hospital registers, surgeons' morning reports, and sanitary commission correspondence. These describe wound type, transport assignment, and outcomes such as amputation advised or return to duty. Names of surgeons and stewards are recorded. Laborers who carried litters are not consistently named. These records are housed in federal record groups and in the surviving papers of military hospitals attached to the Department of the South. Not all volumes are complete, and gaps in July entries are documented in later summaries. Burial and memorial documentation appears in several forms. Confederate garrison accounts note the disposal of Union dead in trenches near the work. Northern reports refer to interments on the beach. Post-war National Cemetery registers show reinterments from multiple coastal sites, but do not always assign identities. Church registers in Charleston and Beaufort include services and memorial entries for named men where bodies were not recovered. The entries are brief and conform to each registry's practice. Local repositories hold the parish volumes and municipal death lists. Pension and dependent files supply affidavits and testimony taken under oath. Widows' parents and siblings state relationships, dates of enlistment, and the last known status. Comrades' affidavits recite circumstances of wounding or last sight. Files sometimes contain letters from commanding officers written to families immediately after the assault. Cross-references occur to regimental returns and to the printed departmental reports. These records are housed in federal archives and provide the only surviving narrative for some men listed as missing. The press layer is wide and inconsistent in detail. Northern metropolitan papers print dispatches from Morris Island with casualty tables and qualitative phrases such as storm of grape and canister. Corrections appear in subsequent issues with names respelled or numbers revised. Black newspapers elevate the conduct of the regiment and print letters from observers and participants. Southern papers print garrison accounts and official notices. Each title adheres to its editorial standard and deadline. All of these are recoverable in microfilm series and digital databases. Later state publications assemble the regimental record into a yearbook with summaries by company and annual totals. These volumes often settle names under killed, wounded, or missing based on information received months after the action. The compilation practice can preserve early uncertainty even after a private letter or affidavit clarifies a case. In those instances, the earlier uncertainty remains visible when copies of returns were bound before the correction arrived. State archives maintain these print series and the manuscript returns from which they were drawn. Private diaries and notebooks kept by officers and enlisted men add details such as the hour marked by a watch, the direction of wind, or the sequence of the color parties entering the ditch. These are individual witnesses and must be handled as such. Some were typed and circulated to family before deposit in a library. Others survive as originals with pencil entries smudged or faint. The physical artifacts are found in university collections, historical societies, and family papers deposited over many decades. Their language is private and precise. A separate layer is oral memory recorded decades later. Interviews conducted in the late 1930s under the Federal Writers Project include accounts by elderly residents of James Island and Charleston, who described hearing guns, seeing ambulances, or recalling work details sent to Morris Island after the fight. This is folklore and oral history, not contemporaneous evidence, and it carries the limitations of memory compression and community retelling. The transcripts identify informants, locales, and dates. They are stored in state archives and national libraries with fieldworkers' names on the covers. One such oral reminiscence mentions a stretcher party wagon passing a named crossroads at night and halting for want of light. The informant places the scene on the road between the landing and the north end of the island. The transcript is typed with a handwritten correction to the place name. This material is labeled as an oral recollection and must be cross-checked against transport and medical returns. The same packet includes a note about a lantern dropped in the sand and recovered later by a child. This remains an unverified detail and is treated as folklore. The identities of recorders are partly known. Departmental reports bear the names and ranks of those who signed them. Regimental and company returns identify adjutants and clerks. Medical registers list the surgeons of the day. The compiled state volumes credit the Adjutant General's office. The 1890s regimental narrative bears the author's rank and company. Oral history transcripts carry the Federal Writers Project fieldworker's name and the supervising editor's initials. The diary fragments show the hands of officers and enlisted men who preserved notebooks through heat and damp. Repository paths are straightforward. Federal printed reports are in major research libraries and digitized. Service records and pension files are in the National Archives. State muster rolls and adjutant reports are in the Massachusetts State Archives. Medical and burial records are split between federal holdings and local church and cemetery registers. The Black Press resides in specialized collections with strong holdings in New York. Charleston and Columbia hold municipal and state records relevant to the site. The Writers Project transcripts are in state archives and the Library of Congress. Two technical discrepancies organize the present inquiry. The first concerns time marking as dusk about sunset and 9 p.m. appear for the same event across different reports. Resolving which witness used local solar time, which used regimental time, and which estimated after the fact will affect sequencing of the color party's ascent, the repulse at the ditch, and the hours when wounded were removed. The second concerns the persistence of missing for names that appear in church registers, or the press implying that corrections did not propagate to all administrative copies. A narrow piece of oral history data intersects both discrepancies. A resident interviewed in 1937 stated that ambulances moved along the James Island Road at an hour after the moon rose and that the first wagon returned before midnight. This memory, if tethered to tide and moon tables, could bracket the removal timeline when official minutes are inconsistent. It remains folklore and is therefore flagged as such. It is useful as a guide for checking transport logs, not as a standalone proof. Its validity depends on independent contemporary confirmation. Names attached to the record will be handled with the same hierarchy. Signatures on official reports stand at the top for time and action. Regimental and company returns determine status and sequence within the unit. Medical and transport registers verify wounds and movements. Burial and memorial registers confirm or deny recovery. Press accounts supply public framing and occasional lists. Pension files fix kinship and last known facts. Diaries supply internal observation. Oral histories add remembered context but are used with caution. Items without corroboration are noted and set aside until matched to a contemporary source. The following micro-hint belongs to the administrative history of the material rather than to the battle itself. It illustrates a gap that affects the chain of custody for oral records. The field worker who recorded this testimony vanished 2 years later on the same road. The sentence appears in a supervisor's marginal note in a transcript cover and bears no further explanation. It is presented here as written without inference. It marks a discontinuity in the paperwork that may or may not relate to conditions of field work. It is retained as part of the file history. The methodological path therefore begins at the departmental reports for timestamps and action verbs follows through to regimental and company returns for named status lines. checks medical and transport registers for corroboration of movement scans, burial, and memorial registers for disposition tests, newspaper lists against official tallies, verifies pension affidavits for final statuses and kinship, reads diaries against the clock, and place names, and finally treats oral recollections as pointers to check rather than as evidence to settle any contested point. Each step is documented in the order consulted. A minor research question follows from the discrepancies above and is sufficient to sustain continued attention. It asks whether the sequence implied by dusk about sunset and 9 p.m. can be reconciled to a single operational timeline that places the color party's cresting of the parapet, the repulse at the ditch, and the first removal of wounded within a consistent framework. It also asks whether names that remain missing in bound returns can be resolved by cross-referencing church registers and pension affidavits submitted in the months following the assault. An account taken down in the late 1930s from an elderly resident of the same district says that on certain nights the sound of marching rose from the sandflats after dark, and that voices counted in a rhythm the speaker associated with drill. The interviewee adds that no patrol was scheduled on those nights and that the sound traveled with the tide. The transcript marks the statement as recollection. The interviewer asks whether any participants were seen. The answer is no, and the entry closes with the interviewer's initials. This is folklore and remains unverified. A morning report for a company of the 54th Massachusetts dated July 1863 includes the column headings for present, absent, and on extra duty. Underneath, a clerk adds the line reserved for casualties in action with numerals for killed, wounded, and missing. Names are grouped by status. A separate remark notes ammunition issued and turn-in. The document is signed by the acting company officer. It is preserved in the manuscript series associated with the regiment and duplicated in a later state compilation. A superstition recorded by a Federal Writers Project interviewer attributes unlucky outcomes to a lantern dropped in the sand during a hurried removal of wounded. The storyteller asserts that no lamp left burning on the beach would ever show a steady flame again. The interviewer writes in brackets that the informant could not provide a date or a unit. The text is short and set between two longer recollections about work details. The absence of corroboration is noted. The passage is retained as a specimen of belief rather than fact. A set of runaway advertisements clustered in June and July name plantations on James and John's Islands and warn boatmen against carrying away the persons described. Descriptions include clothing, speech, and kin. Some notices cite previous attempts to flee and the possibility of enlistment with the United States forces. Payments are promised upon delivery to specific addresses. The typography is consistent with other legal and commercial notices. The series provides a map of intent that points toward federal positions on the Sea Islands. An oral reminiscence taken from a woman who kept house along the road from the landing recalls a line of wagons moving at night, and a driver who refused water because the barrels must remain sealed for a military count. The speaker locates the event in the same month as the assault. She names no regiment. The interviewer queries whether she knew anyone in the wagons. She replies that she heard only voices. The file is indexed under her surname and the road name. The text is identified as memory of uncertain date. A regimental return compiled at month's end lists men absent with wounds and men absent without report. Besides several names, a clerk writes supposed killed based on statements of comrades. A column for remarks contains short entries carried to rear seen at ditch last seen with colors. The handwriting shifts mid-page. A signature closes the return. The arithmetic totals are checked by a second hand. The sheet carries all the marks of a working document under pressure. A dream vision, recorded by a minister in his notebook during Reconstruction, relates that a congregant spoke of following a file of men along the shore where the footprints remained even when the tide rose. The minister dates the conversation by month and year and connects it to a memorial service for those not returned. He does not assert the vision as fact. He includes it as pastoral record of grief and belief. The notebook later entered a church archive. The editor's note classifies the passage as devotional writing. A quarterly report from the Freedmen's Bureau office lists petitions by widows and parents seeking information on missing men believed to have fallen in the assault. Affidavits are attached asserting marriage dependency and last known status. The report summarizes responses received from military authorities and records cases where no reply was found. The format is tabular, the language is restrained. The paper trail shows the persistence of inquiry after the event and the administrative channels through which such inquiries moved. A ghost story set down by a teacher working on St. Helena Island tells of a file of soldiers heard to count cadence at the edge of the marsh when no drill was scheduled. The narrative offers no names and ends with a statement that some things keep walking until they are accounted for. The teacher signs with initials. The interviewer notes that the story circulated among students as a caution against walking alone. The lack of dates is flagged. The item remains folklore and is not used to establish events. A letter from a Charleston court clerk to a colleague across the river reports that a case concerning alleged assistance to runaways would be continued for lack of a principal witness. The clerk mentions rumors that the witness died during federal operations on the barrier islands. The letter encloses a list of exhibits including 2 notices clipped from a newspaper and a hand-drawn map of a creek crossing. The language is sparse. The document sits in a civil file among unrelated matters. It provides context for movement through the area in the same season. A field note by an assistant surgeon names the men he saw at a transport scow after nightfall and records which were moved inland before midnight. The note mentions the shortage of stretchers and the use of door planks. It includes the tide reading as told to him by a boatman. It does not mention music or voices. It is a utilitarian list. Later, the names align with entries in hospital registers. The note survives as a single sheet among medical papers retained by the surgeon's family. A belief reported by a church elder holds that a bell rung for the dead would carry the names of those not recovered to the far shore. The elder ties the belief to a funeral with no body present. The interviewer writes that the elder would not sing the lament he associated with the practice. There is no corroborating document for the bell ritual at that date. The passage is marked belief. Its value is anthropological rather than evidentiary. It tells what communities thought was required when records failed. A set of muster abstracts reproduced in a state adjutant's annual volume prints the company totals and carries forward unresolved cases under the heading missing. Months later, a subsequent volume corrects some names to killed in action based on affidavit and burial notes. The mismatch between volumes demonstrates the lag in administrative correction. The abstracts are durable. They cannot be amended after binding. The corrections live beside them in a later book. Researchers must consult both to avoid perpetuating the earlier uncertainty. A remembered omen described by a fisherman's cooperative secretary speaks of gulls lifting in a line toward the north beach on a night when the wind did not favor such movement. The secretary says older men took it as a sign of an approaching party. The secretary recounts this as something heard in youth. No date is offered. There is no military log attached. The transcript is therefore classified as an environmental superstition. It is recorded without inference and without use as proof. A consolidated casualty table prepared by a department staff officer aggregates figures from multiple regiments engaged and marks the assault unsuccessful with loss heavy. Beneath the table, an addendum notes discrepancies in hour and sequence among the reports. The officer lists the sources consulted and the date of compilation. The table stands as a reconciled administrative account. It has the authority of the office that produced it. It cannot tell where an individual fell in the dark. It is a frame and not a memory. A remembered prayer spoken by a woman in a contraband settlement asks for the safe return of a son named only by first name. The prayer is written down by a mission teacher and appended to a list of needed supplies. The teacher adds a note that the son's company was said to have gone forward at dusk. The paper is later filed among receipts. The prayer is not an affidavit. It does not move a claim. It stands as a trace of expectation. It is not used to date movements. A saying attributed to older watermen tells that footprints laid on wet sand by men with a duty to finish a march will hold their shape longer than ordinary. The remark is written by an interviewer in indirect speech. The interviewer does not test the claim. The remark is not associated with a weather table or an hour. It functions as a belief about perseverance. It does not alter a roster. It explains nothing the records can prove. It belongs to the same category as other survivals of language. A court letter issued in Boston months after the fight transmits certified copies of a service record to a petitioner who seeks a widow's pension and needs proof that marriage and service overlapped. The court letter lists the pages certifying enlistment company and status. The clerk notes that the status is missing at the time of the last return. The clerk adds that further proof may be supplied by affidavits of comrades. The paperwork illustrates the formal path between battlefield absence and domestic dependency. A final recollection from a man who lived near the causeway states that the sound of men counting cadence ceased when the tide turned and that the beach held imprints until first light. He admits he could have heard drilling from the fort and misjudged direction. His statement closes with a remark that no one he asked would say who led the file. The transcript ends with the field worker's initials and date. It is indexed under sound phenomena. It does not stand as an account of the assault. It is an echo of how people filled the silence left by the lists. Assault commenced at dusk. Outer works briefly carried. Repulse followed. No survivors at the forward ditch. The drums still answered that night. Color party advanced. Staff broken. Colors preserved. Bearer severely wounded and removed to the rear. The flag shadowed the sand and kept moving after the voices stopped. Company morning report lists: killed, wounded, missing. Names entered in order of roll. Hold fast, keep step, and carry. Enemy fire severe and continuous. Bay and marsh constricted both flanks. Stretcher service impeded. A line of wagons moved without lamps and someone counted to keep from falling. Casualties verified by officers present. Totals transmitted before midnight. Signatures recorded. A bell was rung for those not returned, and the sound traveled farther than any man. Weather south wind. Surf moderate. Ammunition expended by caliber recorded. The tide spoke in threes and the feet answered twice. Search parties found no living at the parapet after counterfire ceased. Counting did not cease until the small hours. Missing carried forward to month end. Remarks to follow when obtained. The road heard names called plainly, though none replied. Pickets detained laborers with false passes. Releases issued to those on authorized lists. A lantern dropped that week never burned straight again. Hospital entries read: gunshot wound, contusion, amputation advised, surgeons named, stewards noted, bring back the one named only by his first name, interment near the work with comrades, no further particulars supplied. Sand keeps what it is given until morning, loss heavy, figures reconciled with departmental tables, officers and men accounted as per returns. Some things keep walking until they are accounted for. Departures after dark recorded for transport scows. Barrels of water and crates of stores listed. One trip delayed. No bell should be left silent when names remain open. Affidavit of widow and of comrade last seen at the ditch. Decision pending. Footprints held their shape though the edge water touched them. Case continued for lack of principal witness. Rumor of death during federal operations on the Barrier Islands. The witness borrowed a coat and was not seen again. Supposed killed, written beside several names. Arithmetic checked by a second hand. Totals balanced. Splinters from a broken pole were kept in bottles for fevers. Corrections to appear in a subsequent volume. Earlier pages remain unamended. A woman heard the cadence and kept it while carrying water. Union dead interred in a trench near the work as later printed by the garrison. Counting crossed the flats and did not misstep. Firing ceased for intervals of minutes according to one return, resumed with severity according to another. Silence held the length of a prayer, and then the counting resumed. Color sergeant delivered to the rear, condition severe, flag preserved. Children said the staff was taller than any man. Picket line maintained until morning. Reliefs posted. No incident beyond sporadic fire. Voices called names at the causeway before first light. Petitions entered by widows and parents. Replies requested from military authorities. Some cases closed, others without reply. A bell for the missing seeks the far shore. Tide state noted as evening low water. Moonrise not recorded in the return. Gulls rose in a straight line to the north beach against the wind that night. I last saw him at the ditch and could not reach him under fire. The sandprints held until morning and no one stepped on them. Door planks used as stretchers. Shortage recorded. Bearers unnamed. Hands kept time to a tune with no words. Enemy strength unknown. Estimates vary. Reports disagree on sequence and hour. An old drum answered from the far bank. Ammunition issued and turned in accounted. Deficiencies none reported. Hold fast, keep step, and carry. Company officers certify the names listed. Pay due entered. Stoppages blank. An unnamed marcher kept the number when others lost it. Corrections received too late for this edition. Figures revised next issue. A late word never crossed the water. Stretcher parties returned before midnight. Asterisks marked delays on one log. Counting ended when the tide turned. Boatmen reported tide reading at departure. Clerk wrote initials. Cargo tallied by line. The road tasted salt and the wheels left marks. Names added as information arrived. Columns adjusted. Remarks appended. Names called in pairs and the air kept them. Assault unsuccessful. Departmental table summarizes loss. The drums still answered that night. Later status unresolved in several cases. Files docketed, margins showed dates without further note. No word came. Certified copies enclosed for petitioner. Status missing at last return. Further proof invited. A pot was set aside for those who did not come. The commander fell on the parapet. Succession recorded. Signature closes the report. A stone can stand for an empty place if the bell has said the name. Scow moved wounded inland. Signatures by initials. No passenger list by name. No lamp should face the water after such a night. Signature recorded. Totals verified. Arithmetic consistent with departmental table. Older ones warned not to walk the flats alone. No explanation attached to several entries. Enclosures cited not found. Explanations arrive slow and do not change the sand. The next line is missing. Only one word remains returned. A voice said the rest, but the paper did not keep it. Clerical hand changes at mid-page. Ink blot obscures a surname. A name was spoken and no answer came. Entry reads, see enclosure A. The enclosure is absent from the file. A lantern glow was seen near the shore after the hour. Affidavit rejected for lack of proof. Later affidavit accepted from another witness. A neighbor heard the wheel and knew the cart. Correction printed in a subsequent number. Prior misprint persists in citations. The later word did not still the earlier step. No body recovered in several cases. Memorial services recorded in church registers. The bell carried the name. Muster called before dawn. Companies answered by letter. Absences marked. Counting ended before the sun. Weather south wind. Surf moderate. Remarks column otherwise blank. The air moved in threes and the feet in twos. Some cases closed in the quarter after the assault. Others remain open in ledgers. Some steps continue. County migration maps compiled in the late 1860s and 1870s mark lines moving from the Sea Islands toward inland towns and upriver counties. A parish notebook from the same period lists households that held memorial services without bodies present. The map's arrows are counted by township and decade. The notebook's entries are counted by pew and date. A notation on the map calls the movement seasonal and work-seeking. A notation beside the parish line calls the service for those not returned. The cartographer signs with initials and a date. The clerk signs with a surname and a page number. The map's legend uses solid lines and dotted lines for routes confirmed and routes inferred. The clerk's margin uses a cross mark and a blank where names are uncertain. Both pages travel in parallel without touching each other in the record. Testimony given before a reconstruction agent in Charleston records a widow who names her husband's company, describes the last letter received, and states that neighbors heard his name called in the night after the assault. A mission teacher's notebook from the same ward copies a refrain used at funerals when no body is present. The affidavit is sworn and witnessed with the agent noting credible I. The refrain is written without staff or melody, only syllables. The widow's paper is routed to a military office for confirmation. The notebook remains in the mission collection with no routing stamp. The affidavit closes with the phrase, status missing at last return. The notebook closes with sung 3 times. The state recognizes the former as evidence and the latter as memory. Both describe absence and the way a community holds it. A soldier's letter written from a hospital transport names 2 men last seen at the ditch and states that stretcher parties were called off under heavy fire. An elderly resident interviewed decades later says the counting on the flats ended when the tide turned and started again when a drum answered from the far bank. The letter gives time as after dark. The interview gives time as when the water changed. The letter reaches a newspaper and is printed with minor edits. The interview reaches a state archive and is typed with bracketed notes. The letter fixes 2 names in a declarative past. The interview leaves names unspoken and treats the sound as the subject. Both describe interruption and resume. A bureau register itemizes petitions from parents and spouses seeking information and lists replies received and not received. A church minute book notes a practice that when no reply comes, a bell is rung at the close of service and a prayer is said only with a first name. The register uses columns titled Petitioner Relation Unit Last Status Action Taken. The minute uses a single paragraph with the date and the deacon's initials. The register reports that some cases are closed with killed in action and others remain open. The minute reports that in cases open after a season, the bell is rung again. The administrative page moves horizontally across categories. The church page moves vertically across weeks. Both pages record persistence. A county atlas revised after the war shades precincts where freed people established settlements and plots a footpath along the causeway. An oral recollection set down by a teacher describes a caution against walking the flats alone because names are sometimes called before dawn. The atlas labels the path for traffic and supply. The recollection calls the path a place of voices. The atlas sources are listed as surveys and affidavits. The recollection source is a grandmother's saying. The atlas indicates where water and marsh control movement. The recollection indicates where the ear hears what the eye cannot verify. Both mark a line on the same ground. A clerk's letter from Boston transmits certified copies of service records to a petitioner and repeats that status is missing at last return, inviting further proof by comrade affidavit. A remembered prayer copied by a mission teacher asks for the return of a son named only by his first name and adds no further detail. The clerk's letter encloses page references and a raised seal. The prayer is appended to a supply list. The clerk's language is formula. The prayer's language is specific to a household. The letter moves a claim. The prayer moves nothing on paper. Both proceed because something is not settled. A departmental casualty table aggregates regimental figures and states loss heavy, and a subsequent circular corrects the numbers. A neighborhood tale says splinters from a shattered pole were kept in bottles as a ward against fever and should not be opened. The table lists sources and the date of compilation. The circular lists errata and the date of correction. The tale offers no provenance and admits no test. The table and circular regulate numbers across time. The tale regulates conduct across households. Both frame behavior after an event. A set of reinterment registers at a national cemetery records bodies moved from coastal sites without identities assigned and leaves rows blank where names cannot be matched. A family tradition recorded by a teacher says, "A stone can stand for an empty place if the bell has said the name." The registers are complete as far as the forms allow. The tradition fills what the form cannot reach. The registers answer to federal procedure. The tradition answers to parish habit. The registers stop at the last column. The tradition continues at the next service. Both address what it means to lay someone to rest without a name. A black press editorial printed weeks after the assault praises the conduct of the regiment and lists names of the fallen to the extent known. A field worker's transcript preserves a song line used when carrying water to the sick that repeats the words "keep step" and "carry." The editorial places the unit in a larger argument for citizenship and right. The songline places labor in a pattern that sustains weight and distance. The editorial is signed. The singer is not named. The editorial seeks a national audience. The songline speaks within a settlement. Both tie action to belonging. A county migration schedule for the 1870 census indicates outflow from wards near the harbor and inflow toward inland mills and rail points. An elder's note says families who could not recover a body sometimes moved inland so the bell would no longer be heard at night. The schedule counts by dwelling and occupation. The note counts by rooms emptied. The schedule gives a cause as work availability. The note gives a cause as too much ringing. The schedule is objective by design. The note is subjective by witness. Both are reasons recorded by different hands. A court file from Reconstruction contains depositions concerning assistance to runaways on the same routes later used to move wounded with a hand-drawn map of a creek crossing. A superstition recorded by an interviewer warns that a lantern dropped near such crossings will never burn straight again. The map shows bearings and distances. The superstition uses a single sentence. The depositions name men and assert dates. The superstition names nothing and asserts a rule. The map aids a case. The superstition guides behavior around water. Both arise in places where directions and light matter. A soldier's letter printed years later in a regimental history repeats the phrase that the old flag never touched the ground and names the color party. A remembered omen from watermen says gulls rising in a straight line toward the north beach against the wind. Mark an approach and that such signs should be heeded for the sake of those still walking. The letter pins honor to a specific act and record. The omen pins warning to a specific motion and sky. The letter enters the archive of state and regiment. The omen stays among those who depend on reading signs. Both assert that attention has weight. A register of pensions allowed shows cases where missing at last return became killed in action upon receipt of affidavits and church memorial entries. A church list shows memorials repeated annually for names without certitude. The pension register produces a decision and money. The church list produces a service and song. The pension entry closes a file. The list keeps a practice open. The pension procedure recognizes comrade testimony under oath. The practice recognizes community testimony under loss. Both acknowledge that an absence can be carried by more than one kind of proof. A printed sermon delivered in Boston quotes official reports and insists that sacrifice at the works proves the claim to full rights. An unprinted note in a teacher's copybook repeats that some things keep walking until they are accounted for and applies that to ledgers and graves alike. The sermon builds a case with citations. The note builds a caution with an aphorism. The sermon seeks to persuade a city. The note seeks to govern attention in a classroom. The sermon takes the battle into law and policy. The note takes absence into daily practice. Both convert events into instruction. A transport log from the night of the assault lists departures and cargo, but no names. An oral recollection says that voices called names at the causeway and that the air kept them when no answer came. The log is concrete and limited. The recollection is intangible and expansive. The log helps fix tempo. The recollection helps fix what tempo meant. The log cannot say who was on board. The recollection cannot say who called. Both retain the shape of motion without resolving identity. A state adjutant's volume corrects some company totals months later and leaves others unchanged for lack of new returns. A deacon's marginal note explains that when a name remains open, the refrain at the close repeats 3 times instead of once. The volume codifies what can be settled. The note codifies how to live with what cannot. The volume binds. The note instructs. The volume is a final. The note is a rule. Both address closure and its absence using forms they control. A map of the Exoduster movement a decade later shows families leaving coastal counties for Kansas and beyond. An interview recorded in the same period recalls that a family moved because a bell at home rang for a son with no grave and the house did not rest. The map uses arrows and dates. The interview uses a sentence and a reason. The map aligns opportunity with rail and land. The interview aligns departure with sound and memory. The map is a general pattern. The interview is a single house. Both place motion in relation to what is heard. A press correction printed the week after the assault amends a figure and spells a surname differently. A neighborhood account states that a pot was set aside for those who did not come and that its lid should not be lifted until a letter arrived. The correction is an administrative fix. The account is a domestic measure. The correction clarifies a number. The account disciplines a habit. The correction closes a small error. The account holds open a space. Both modify how the event is carried forward. A cemetery memorandum about later trench work at the site notes fragments without identifiers and schedules another pass when tools arrive. A ritual described by a teacher instructs that when fragments are found, the bell should ring and a first name should be spoken, even if it is not known whose it is. The memorandum is procedural. The ritual is prescriptive. The memorandum adds nothing to the roster. The ritual adds an act to the day. The memorandum moves labor. The ritual moves a community to stand and speak. Both recognize fragments as evidence of need. A private notebook kept by a junior officer lists weather hour and locations of companies within the line. A dream recorded by a congregant to a minister describes following a file along the shore and finding prints that did not wash out. The notebook measures by instrument and place. The dream measures by image and persistence. The notebook is consulted against other returns. The dream is referred to in a service. The notebook holds its value by matching. The dream holds its value by being told. Both recur when talk returns to the night. A final mirror lies in the words repeated across documents and songs returned missing carried kept. The ledger uses return to mean a man present for duty. The margin uses return to mean a body recovered. The refrain uses return to ask for safe passage. The prayer uses return to close a line. The newspaper lists missing under the assault. The church uses missing to decide the number of repetitions at the end. A child saying uses missing to explain why a bottle is not to be opened. The report writes carried for colors saved. The song writes carried for burdens borne. The affidavit writes carried for movement to a rear line. The same words move through law paper, tune, and room. Across these pages, the second layer of fact proceeds with maps sworn, statements, letters, tables, and registers. Across the same pages, a second layer of tradition proceeds with songs, rites, dreams, and sayings. The first tries to end a case, The second tries to keep a place. The first advances by totals and stamps. The second advances by repetitions and marks. They do not cancel each other. They meet at certain nouns at certain hours and at certain acts that recur. Where a map shades a precinct, a song names a reason. Where a register leaves a blank, a bell is rung. Where a letter fixes a time, a drum answers it in memory. The result is a field in which the route of paper and the route of belief cross at points a researcher can locate and a household can recognize. The morning reports for July close with arithmetic carried to a final line. The totals match the departmental table. A clerk signs and dates. The margin holds a short note, no further particulars. The space beneath remains unused. The page is turned and the next page begins another month. A transport log lists departures and stores with asterisks beside delays. The clerk marks the tide reading as given by a boatman. No names are attached to the runs. The signature is initials only. A blank column follows for remarks and is left empty. The log ends without addendum. A consolidated return revises figures from earlier dispatches. One surname is respelled. Another line receives a different tally for wounded. The changed numbers are initialed in a smaller hand. No explanatory paragraph accompanies the correction. The table is filed. A departmental circular acknowledges errors and prints errata. The errata do not address those listed as missing. A sentence states that further information will be printed as received. Nothing else follows in the file. The binding closes around the gap. A pension register shows cases allowed and cases rejected. In the allowed column, affidavits of comrades are cited. In the rejected column, proof is said to be insufficient. Notes in the margin direct the reader to consult church registers for memorial entries. The notes are not part of the formal decision. The register continues to the next district. A set of burial memoranda records interments near the work and the later movement of remains inland. Several entries carry the phrase identity not ascertained. Where identity is not ascertained, the lines are short and regular. No conjecture appears. The writing is even to the end of the page. A company descriptive book retains names under missing through the month's close. Besides several names, a second hand adds supposed killed. A third hand adds no further information months later. The ink is pale by that time. The page remains legible. An adjutant's letter forwards certified copies of service for a widow's claim. The letter repeats status missing at last return and invites further proof. No further proof arrives in the envelope. A docket stamp marks the case as pending and then closed for inactivity. The folder is tied with string. A court file from Reconstruction includes a hand-drawn map of a creek crossing used by laborers and soldiers alike. The map shows bearings and distances and the creek's bend. A note in another hand remarks that the witness to the drawing is deceased. No testimony supplements the drawing. The map is returned to the sleeve. A hospital register page for the same week lists gunshot wounds and contusions, several with the remark amputation advised. The register gives the surgeon's name and the ward. There is no column for visitors and no column for last words. The page ends on a line not at the bottom. The next page begins a new ward. A black newspaper prints an editorial praising the conduct of the regiment and arguing a claim to rights. The editorial includes names as then known. A correction in the following issue amends a number and respells a surname. The correction column is narrow and unsigned. The paper moves to other topics. A county migration schedule tallies households moving inland in the late 1860s. The schedule describes work as the cause of movement. It does not mention bells or funerals. It records heads of household and ages. The arithmetic is careful. The totals are carried to the county line. A national cemetery ledger records reinterments from coastal sites. Where identity is unknown, the ledger writes unknown. The entries are consistent. A printed form governs the hand. There is no space for conjecture in the form. The sequence of lines does not vary. A mission school notebook copies a refrain used at funerals without bodies. The field worker notes the words as syllables, not as a hymn with staff. The notation ends with sung 3 times. No commentary is added. The page is thin from handling. A Federal Writers Project transcript preserves a recollection that voices called names at the causeway before dawn, and that the air kept them when no answer came. The interviewer writes in brackets that no unit was named. A date is given for the interview, but not for the event. The transcript closes with the interviewer's initials. The cover shows where at the fold. A parish minute book records that when no reply comes from the authorities, the bell is rung again at the next service. The entry is brief and dated. A crossmark appears in the margin for the first name spoken. The same crossmark appears in the margins of subsequent weeks. The crossmarks accumulate. A private letter printed later in a regimental history repeats that the old flag never touched the ground and names men last seen at the ditch. The letter is dated after dark and sent on a transport. The editor includes it with few changes. No answering letter from the named men is printed. The chapter continues. A clerk's memorandum lists enclosures A, B, and C. Enclosure A is described as a report, enclosure B as a return, enclosure C as a list of names. Only B survives in the folder. The memorandum is initialed. The loss is not explained elsewhere in the file. A teacher's copybook keeps a note that some things keep walking until they are accounted for. The teacher applies the remark to ledgers as well as to graves. No authority is cited. The remark sits between lists of supplies. The copybook turns to a lesson plan on the next page. A neighborhood account repeats that a pot was set aside for those who did not come and that its lid should not be lifted until a letter arrived. The account does not list a date or a street. It lists the sequence of acts only. The pot in question is not preserved. The note is brief. A field note by an assistant surgeon describes door planks used for stretchers and a shortage recorded. The note gives a tide reading told by a boatman. The names of bearers are not written. The note ends with the last patient moved before midnight. No postscript follows. A departmental table aggregates reports from all engaged regiments and concludes loss heavy. Beneath the table, an addendum remarks that hour and sequence differ among sources. The addendum does not reconcile the difference. It states the fact and lists the consulted papers. The volume proceeds to another action. A church register adds memorial entries for names without graves. The entries are formulaic. A first name is spoken. A line is drawn beneath the name. A date is added. No other particulars appear. The book advances steadily. A parish notebook records a ritual for finding fragments at the shore. Ring the bell and speak a first name. The instruction is terse. The note is not dated. The instruction is repeated on the next page in the same words. It is an operating rule, not a story. A small envelope in a family file holds a splinter said to have come from a flagstaff. The paper around it is old but undated. There is no certificate of provenance. The envelope is labeled in pencil with a surname. The splinter remains in the envelope. A migration atlas shades precincts where freed families moved inland. The legend defines solid lines for confirmed routes and dotted lines for routes inferred. Dotted lines predominate along the causeway. The atlas includes a date and the name of the compiler. There is no narrative attached to the shading. A minister's notebook records that a congregant described following a file along the shore in a dream and finding prints that did not wash out. The minister writes the month and the year. He does not assert whether the dream is true. He includes it as a pastoral record. The notebook remains in the archive. A final page in a company book shows pay due entered and stoppages blank. The arithmetic is correct. The line for remarks is empty. The hand changes slope at the last entry. A small blot marks the edge. The book closes. No estimate is offered for the hour when voices ceased. Reports cite dusk after dark and 9 o'clock. None measure the quarter between. No witness describes the silence. The administrative record does not account for it. The lines end without a notation. The oral sources do not agree on the number of repetitions at the end of the refrain. Some say 3. Others say it continued until the bell rang. A few do not report a count at all. They report only that something answered. The answer is not fixed to a time. A transport list carries no names. A cemetery list carries no names for certain spots. A pension list carries names with decisions. A newspaper list carries names with errors and corrections. A parish list carries first names without surnames. The group of lists produces a shape without a single voice. No entry in the departmental volume addresses the belief that footprints remain until morning if the march is unfinished. No entry in the folklore series assigns a unit to the counting heard near the causeway. The two sets of papers stand apart. The nouns they share remain few. The encountered hours remain adjacent but not identical. A docket note on a field worker's folder states that the interviewer who transcribed the testimony about the counting vanished 2 years later on the same road. No cause is recorded. The note is in a supervisor's hand. The remark does not continue onto another page. The folder is complete as far as the archive is concerned. A clerk closing a return writes later status unresolved. A deacon closing a service rings the bell once more. A table closing a column sets a total. A refrain closing a breath repeats. The actions are direct. None offers explanation. The sequence tightens. No witness writes about the interval between volleys that night. No ledger measures what occupied the space between the entries. No sermon records how long families stood outside before the bell. No diary counts the steps after the last command. The record keeps to its forms. The memory keeps to its forms. The last letter printed concerning the color party ends with the flag never touched the ground. There is no letter from those named as last seen. The printer's page is even. The line breaks are dictated by column width. The line about the flag remains the last line. An index instructs the reader to see enclosure A for a list of names carried forward. The enclosure is not present. The index has no supplement. The overseer's note says only on file. The box contains no further sheet. The trail ends at the label. The church page for the following week repeats the practice as written. The bell is rung. A first name is spoken. The refrain is repeated 3 times. The line is drawn under the date. The page is turned. The tide chart for the harbor shows evening low water on the date of the assault. The chart adds nothing else. It is referenced by logs but not by names. It joins the other documents by proximity only. It stands without comment. The record yields the same nouns on every pass: returned, missing, carried, kept. Returned appears in the muster as present for duty in the burial note, as recovered in the prayer as requested. Missing appears in the table in the correction in the pension lines. Carried appears for colors and for stretchers. Kept appears in the refrain as a command and in the domestic note as a rule for the pot. The words do not change form. They change company. The last parish entry for the month uses the first name again and adds no surname. The same cross mark is placed in the margin. The bell is marked as rung. There is no final note. The book goes on. No one wrote again after the errata in the metropolitan paper for that week. No departmental supplement corrected the last unresolved names that summer. No survivor's note was added to the transport log in another hand. No private letter surfaced for the men at the ditch. The columns remained aligned and silent. The paper trail is here in the present tense and within reach. Departmental reports sit in printed volumes and digitized scans. Regimental and company returns rest in state boxes. Service records and pensions are filed under names and numbers. Hospital registers survive in bound ledgers. Burial notes appear in cemetery books. Black newspapers are spooled on microfilm and copied as images. Federal Writers Project interviews are typed, indexed, and served as PDFs. Parish minutes and mission copybooks lie in thin, hand-bound sets. Archivists label conserve and catalog. Researchers request unfold and read. The nouns repeat. A staff officer's table of loss is found by a graduate student compiling a list of engagements for a thesis. The table is stored in a federal volume and in an image repository. A regimental morning report is found by a descendant who writes the name in a reading room request slip. The report is stored in a state archive paged from offsite. A transport log is found by a park interpreter preparing a tour. The log is stored with a coastal installation's papers, its ink still legible. Each finder notes context and date. Each item returns to its shelf. A parish register line is found by a local historian indexing church books. The register is stored in a diocesan archive. A mission school notebook is found by a curator assembling an exhibit on coastal education. The notebook is stored in a denominational collection. A teacher's copybook note about a refrain sung 3 times is found by a musician researching spirituals. The note is stored with school reports and supply lists. The entries read as they were written. No interpretation is attached to the margin. A bureau file of affidavits is found by a legal historian tracing the path of dependency claims. The file is stored under a record group with filmed copies. A widow's sworn statement is found by a high school class working through primary sources. The statement is stored with endorsements and routing slips. A rejection for lack of proof sits next to an acceptance granted on a later affidavit. Both are stored under the same case number. The structure of decision is visible. The distance between paper and body remains. A family envelope is found among donated papers and labeled with a surname. The envelope is stored in a manuscript vault. Inside the envelope, a splinter lies in folded paper. There is no certificate of origin. A note says Flagstaff. A processing archivist writes an accession number and a neutral description. The object and the claim sit together without resolution. The present tense holds both. A fieldworker's transcript with a remark about counting at the causeway is found by an ethnographer. The transcript is stored in a state archive and at a national library. A supervisor's docket note states that the interviewer who recorded the testimony vanished 2 years later on the same road. The folder is complete as processed. No cause is recorded. The remark is preserved as a fact of paperwork, not as an event to be solved. The file remains as is. A court letter forwarding certified copies of service is found by a genealogist. The letter is stored in an envelope with a docket number. The letter repeats missing at last return and invites further proof. No reply is present. The docket stamp shows the case closed for inactivity. The envelope contains no enclosure A. The label instructs a reader to see what is not there. A cemetery ledger entry is found by a volunteer who photographs pages for a registry. The ledger is stored at the cemetery office and in a digital copy. The line reads unknown and records a trench moved inland. No later correction appears. A separate ledger lists burials by name elsewhere. The two lines do not meet. The ledgers stand in their forms. A black newspaper editorial and its correction are found by a journalist working on a feature about the regiment. The editorial and correction are stored in metropolitan microfilm and in a database. The editorial names acts and asserts a claim. The correction respells a surname and amends a number. The correction does not touch the men listed as missing. The page is turned, the paper moves to other news. The record of the name remains as corrected print, not as a letter home. A county migration schedule is found by a demographer. The schedule is stored with census returns and maps. The schedule shows movement inland and credits work as cause. Parish minutes found by a local archivist, note bells rung for names without graves and services repeated when no answer comes. The minutes are stored on the same coast. The schedule and the minutes point in the same direction and speak different languages. Both are current in the hands that consult them. A soldier's letter naming 2 men last seen at the ditch is found in a printed regimental history. The letter is stored in the printed volume and in a library's catalog. The men named do not appear in a later column of personal correspondence. No one adds a counter letter. The printed page does not return to the subject. The silence is not a theorem. It is an endpoint in typesetting. A consolidated return that carries totals forward is found by a teacher guiding students through arithmetic on a blackboard. The return is stored in a state series and in a scan. A deacon's note instructing that a first name be spoken and a bell rung when no reply arrives is found by a community historian. The note is stored in a parish book and in a photocopy. The return reaches a sum. The note prescribes an action. The sum stands, the action repeats. Present documents describe present uses. The hours still do not reconcile. Reports cite dusk after dark and 9 o'clock. Logs carry tide readings without names. Witnesses in later interviews assign times by water and sound. None of these lines erase the others. A modern table can align them on a screen and display overlap and gap. The table does not create a voice for those whose names remain carried forward without return. The table is a tool. The gap is the fact. The nouns remain within reach and usable. Returned in the muster means present for duty. Returned in a burial note means recovered body. Returned in a refrain means asked for and not yet granted. Missing in a printed table prompts a later correction for a figure. Missing in a pension file prompts a decision. Missing in a parish practice prompts a bell. Carried in the report refers to colors saved. Carried in a surgeon's note refers to a litter. Carried in a song refers to weight borne. Kept in a domestic note forbids opening a pot. Kept in the refrain orders the body to hold cadence. The present tense reader watches these words work. What remains unclear is limited and named. The sequence of minutes along the parapet is not reconstructed with certainty. The identity of some interments is not ascertained. The enclosures cited in a clerk's memorandum are absent. The last letter home for particular men is not found. The note about a field worker's disappearance is not supported by an additional document. The line that reads returned without context points 2 ways and resolves neither. These are the boundaries of the file, not a failure of attention. Who finds and where it lies is now established. Federal volume state return service records, hospital books, cemetery ledgers, black press reels, WPA transcripts, parish minutes, mission notebooks, court files, family envelopes. Each is located, labeled, and kept. Names of finders change by year. Student archivist, descendant, ranger, musician, teacher, journalist. The work is ordinary and steady. The present tense sustains it. The echo replies in small ways that do not claim more than they can hold. A classroom reads the refrain and counts 3 repetitions. A parish rings the bell for a name with no surname. A family stands at a trench plot that bears only a number. A ranger points to a map and traces a dotted line along the causeway. The drums in the story do not sound in the archive. The archive has paper. The sound is saved in the words that say it was heard. The reply is not loud. It is persistent. No one writes again in the ledgers for those names. The errata have long since closed. The departmental volume is complete as printed. The morning report does not gain a postscript. The transport log does not add passengers in a later hand. The parish book moves on to other months. The present tense sentence is simple. The documents end where they end. The air in the reading room is quiet. The motif returns because it is part of what is documented and what is said. Drums are reported by interviewees as a sound heard on certain nights. A river tide is recorded by logs as a reading taken at departure. A bell is recorded by minutes as rung when a reply does not arrive. A dream is recorded by a minister as testimony of a congregant. None is an embellishment here. Each is a line in an inventory of sources. Their repetition is an index, not an effect. The documentary voice closes in the present tense with the nouns in place, table return, ledger, minute, letter, refrain. The open questions are itemized without adornment. The repositories are named for use. The traces are carried forward for those who will consult them next. The last factual sentence is unremarkable. A case remains unresolved in the file, and the margin contains no further note. The last factual action is ordinary. The folder is returned to the cart. The echo answers in the same register as a record, not as a performance. A parish bell rung for a first name, a clerk's tide reading, a remembered drum counted by a witness, a dream written in a notebook. No one wrote again, but the drums kept answering. Maybe they didn't disappear, maybe we did. The subject is not absence. It is the way a community keeps time when the ledger does not.